So, hello everyone. I'm glad that so many of you were interested enough to attend this talk on transatlantic relations. Can you all hear me? Yes? Wonderful. Good, good, good. I also want to thank you, of course, for inviting me always. It's really a wonderful pleasure. Transatlantic relations is one of my subfields of interest, and I hope you have received my paper on critical look at transatlantic relations that will come out next year in the Handbook of Critical European Studies. So that should be quite interesting. But I have also other research interests. And just a little bit more about myself so you understand that, where I'm coming from, literally. Of course, my role, I'm an associate professor and direct one of only 7 Jean Monnet Centers of Excellence. So in that sense, we are an important European outpost in the United States. I'm just saying that in case some of you want to do a doctorate with us sometime in the future. And also, yeah, it's a very fairly good research university, Florida International University, despite its name, located in the city of Miami. But I don't know if you have noticed already, I'm not quite American, I'm not quite the American slang, right? So
his name sounds German.
Right, little hint, yes, exactly. So I am actually German-born from Munich, outside Monaco de Baviera, and I've been living in the US, however, for 20 years, and I am double citizen at this point. And so, you know, when you take on another citizenship, right, I would never give up my European one, or German one, but if you give it up, then you automatically think already a lot about transatlantic relations. So that's just sort of where I'm coming from, so I hope that some of my perspectives become a little clearer. Okay, so in the next hour or so, I want to tell you a little bit more about some of the theories behind transatlantic relations and give you updates on what is happening actually. Because probably you're not the only one who's wondering what the hell is happening, right, with the Trump administration and how does that impact on Europe, right? Okay, and I have a nice little slide for you, but first I want to just say something about the title, right? The question, sort of the title of the talk is, will Mars and Venus cooperate? Do you have any idea what Mars and Venus could be, what they mean?
The UK and the USA.
Exactly, and Venus is the EU, of course, right? Exactly, and Mars is the United States. And there's a whole book, or famous article has been written by Robert Kagan. I think that was around the time of the outbreak of the Iraq War in 2003, right? In which he kind of provided these role perceptions to these two partners. And I'm just questioning that, if they ever will cooperate again. Okay, but since, just to kind of, you know, mix it up a little bit, you see here this cartoon. I love political cartoons, and this is just one of them, Donald Trump's view of the world, right? So take that in for a moment and see where you can find your country. Right, so obviously that's pretty clear sort of the stance, even if it is of course overgeneralized. But what becomes apparent, and that's why I also included it, is you can see here definitely 2 major blind spots, I would say, right? That's Europe and that's Africa. Latin America, and Latin America too, but that's expected. But basically you have the one blind spot that we're going to zoom in is on Europe, and I think that's something that's kind of symptomatic for the way the Trump administration, or particularly Donald Trump, is viewing Europe. Are you? Yeah.
The view from space. It's interesting, the view from space. Huh?
Yes, I didn't even see that. Yes. So, to kind of give you two other impressions, I want to zoom in a little bit about the U.S. view first, and then give you an overview of some of the systemic structural questions that we have to consider when talking about transatlantic relations. And then I'm going to give you some mostly public opinion data and end with sort of, what may transatlantic relations evolve into, given our tense relationship right now. Well, this is another one, don't worry, there's only 2 more of these cartoons. Right, so you have here President Obama, right, coming down the airport and says he's happy in Europe. And of course the UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, represented this as well. You're not in Europe. Obviously very telling, particularly great because you're going to have later a Brexit talk. But this tells you that there's also a misunderstanding. As you know, President Obama has been generally beloved by most European publics, and you'll see this also reflected in public opinion polls. But even he, in that sense, is overdrawn. But one of his major foreign policy actions was the so-called pivot to Asia. Right? And that pivot to Asia meant also a pivot away from classic post-war transatlantic relations. It also meant a pivot away from the engagement in the Middle East, in which we had a lot of rather unsuccessful wars being fought and nation-building processes that obviously 20 years later are still not much better, I would say, than they were before. Right? So this is sort of the one moving. And the other that reflects more on internal foreign policy development in Europe, and I think some of you take EU foreign policy, so you may know her. That's High Representative Catherine Ashton, right? After the Lisbon Treaty was ratified, she became the first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. And so here she holds the phone, allegedly at 3 a.m. in the morning, to talk to her counterpart in the US. Yes, Hillary, what's going on? I'm here to help you. That's in fact based on a saying that may or may not Henry Kissinger has made in the 1970s, right? When he kind of said, yeah, well, it's nice that the Europeans are starting to kind of build up a foreign policy collaboration. But if I want to talk to Europe, right, in the middle of the night, who do I call? And then there's one last, just because I just thought of it, one last gag that is symptomatic also for EU foreign policy. So, of course, she's here, right, the High Representative, now post-Lisbon, to answer that call on behalf of the European Union at 3 a.m. in the night. There's another joke after, Catherine Ashton came into power that basically Obama called about a foreign policy issue, the Europeans called the phone number, right, and then he got the answer, sorry, we're not home, press 1 for British, press 2 for French, 3 for German, and so on. Okay, but now let's talk a little bit about sort of the questions that I want to hopefully give you some ideas and answer them at least partially. I'm generally, if you read my piece, you know that I am questioning the classic perception that post-Cold War the EU and the US still need each other. Okay, we can maybe talk about this later, what do you think about this? But some of the questions that impact on that are, for example, how do the financial crisis, the euro crisis, right? How do trade issues, and that's not only related to TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that you probably know, right? That was proposed, was heavily debated in Europe. The Obama administration wanted to, as well as Cecilia Malmström, the former Swedish Trade Commissioner, wanted to get it through, didn't get it through, and now it's basically on ice for the past 2.5 years or so. We don't know if it is ever being resuscitated. In addition to that, we have right now the issue of trade sanctions, stemming not only previously from steel issues, but also most recently from the Airbus-Boeing World Trade Organization case, which you may have heard about it, right? Where basically the US government has cited the European Union governments in front of the WTO's trade dispute settlement panel, because they said, well, you're subsidizing Airbus unfairly. And the Europeans did the same until the basically said, well, US government, you're subsidizing Boeing, the major product manufacturer, unfairly. The first is basically a bilateral trade lawsuit, if you want to call that. The first judgment after many appeal processes has come out that yes, indeed, Airbus is being unfavorably, or favorably, I should say, subsidized. And so the Bush administration reacted very quickly, just 2 weeks ago or so, and started to impose trade sanctions that eventually then on European products that can be ratcheted up over time. Okay? So as in the US-China trade war that's more famous, we also see now the ratcheting up of these trade tensions between the Europeans and the US. And Jean-Claude Juncker, we were just talking about it, was just now in Brussels and in Washington trying to, last-minute shuttle diplomacy, trying to avoid those trade tariffs. And he got some verbal promises, but then again, the Trump administration cannot necessarily rely on that, particularly if it comes from the pumpkin and cheese, right? Good. Brexit is, of course, another thing. Brexit is, as you know, I'm not going to talk much about it, causes a lot of insecurity because you, as well as we, don't know what will happen, right? I mean, for 3 years we've been talking about it, and so that can lead to all kinds of things. However, I don't know, my opinion is just that seeing what happens in Britain itself actually released me a little bit, in the sense that I was afraid that there could be future fragmentation of the European Union occurring, but I don't think any other member state, no matter how unhappy he may be, wants to go through that same kind of polarization and economic stagnation that the UK experienced with it. Yeah, so how do these various, trade issues mostly, but of course also Brexit, how do they threaten the economic cooperation and EU perception in the US? Think about if Brexit really happens next year, right? Then we have a whole different northern transatlantic relationship. So we could see an Anglo competition between the US and the UK as sort of the neoliberal giants against the European Union, right? So that could be also reshaping transatlantic relations. Okay, but it's not only the structural, or let's say political issues that determine the state of transatlantic affairs, it's of course also leadership. And so the question of course then becomes, how are American perceptions of the EU changing with different, vice versa, you can say the same, with different leaders? Has the Atlantic got wider under Trump? I'm pretty sure we can say yes to that. Right? But then again, if you look at what's going on in Europe right now, there's, I would say, a power vacuum or leadership vacuum. Angela Merkel, she's kind of a lame duck chancellor at this point, right? Not very likely not running again as chancellor. You never know, but in these ages. But she said she would not want to run. Macron has his own issues with trying to assume leadership. We have the Visegrad 4 countries that want to also feel more represented, right? As you know, Italy is also tries to become a player. Spain, if they get a more stable government together, could be a good leader. And then, of course, we have Brexit. So there is certainly a leadership vacuum that will make the creation of a stronger transatlantic relations more difficult, because you need partners to do so. And if they're absent, then you can't do this. And then, of course, we also don't find ourselves basically within Europe, and the situation within Europe influences transatlantic relations. Then you have, of course, that special relationship between the European countries and the US, which is sort of idiosyncratically determined by the Cold War. And we have not moved past beyond the Cold War, I would say, in terms of transatlantic relations. And then we have the international system that we cannot forget. There are pressing multilateral issues that should be really, or need to be solved multilaterally with all the major states involved. Climate change, as you know, is one of the most important ones for the Europeans. Not important for the Trump administration, obviously, right? On terrorism, we basically get sort of a paternalistic questioning of European security after some of these attacks that we experienced 2-3 years ago. And as you know, Syria, anyway, the Trump administration is certainly not making things easier, right? And in fact, the impact on Erdogan's government may actually lead us to a reliving of another refugee impact crisis. Okay, so my article then posits, the one that you received, posits that in fact there are enduring differences, and that these differences have become particularly pronounced not only under Trump, but they basically go back to the post-Cold War order. What I'm trying to say is that we had a fairly artificial special relationship between the EU and the US during the Cold War, given the international security climate, and that there's still, at least on an official level, a perceived need to collaborate, but really we have become more independent than necessarily interdependent, and certainly the US has not become indispensable, nor has the transatlantic relationship. And in the article, I made the case that it's not only about the leadership, but it's of course about the difference in socioeconomic models, basically contrasting the European social models, as rudimentary as they are, with American-style neoliberalism that has crept across the Atlantic. Right? Think about this. The European Union itself, as a free market, is one of the vanguards of neoliberalism. So that's kind of ironic as well in itself. And of course, the emergence of a multipolar world order causes a real split, because it seems like the US is not even committed to the West anymore, and the Europeans don't think they have really an ally in them, while Russia, China, and the BRIC countries pose their own challenges. And but I'm of course not the only one who has thought about it. So Tochi and Caro as well, they have sort of given you the classic variations on transatlantic relation that come up over and over again. So you have on the one hand a structural drift. Are we moving into that structural drift? I would probably say yes. Functional partnership based on the function of needing each other in order to solve these multilateral problems. That's maybe a would be nice function, but obviously you can't, that's not happening right now. And European governments are just getting tired of constantly having to adapt to Republican and Democratic governments and their wishes. Or an enduring partnership patterns. There are plenty of more conservative scholars as well as policy makers who will tell you, yes, we need each other, basically that classic argument that you know already. We're the West, right, against the supposed rest, and therefore we need the enduring partnership. But again, with Brexit, that can be split anyway. The US can then have the UK and their special relationship without having to listen to the continent and their own ambitions for independence. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a little bit about the official position that both sides, always policymakers on both sides make. These are unique relations. I inserted here, they are also artificial relations in many ways. Because while, as you can see here on the bottom, there is often being the case made, and it's true, that we have the largest economic relationship between the European Union as a bloc and the United States in terms of finances, in terms of foreign direct investment, and in terms of also general economic trade, as well as services. And that there are, as you can see here, 15 million jobs on both sides are dependent on a functioning transatlantic relationship. What is this? Apparently we have 4 trillion in stocks collectively. Together, the EU with the US represents over 50% of global GDP. This may be outdated at this point. 98% of products are tariff-free. Probably the number has gone down now, obviously. And we're close to 120 billion in official development assistance, both, of course, also being the largest development aid provider in the world substantially. So, but then if you really look at sort of some of the factors, there's again this argument being made, we are partners in global leadership. With regards to particularly Islamic radicalism and the question of terrorism, you have, by and large, similar approaches, right? We've seen it at least after 9/11, you know, when under NATO the Afghanistan actions were concluded. As you know, in 2003, the Iraq invasion was a very different thing, and we've seen this now with be it Libya or Syria right now. We have diverging approaches. Also, the question about security leadership in the world in general, and what to do with NATO. If you talked about NATO, you know that NATO has been more or less in a crisis, I'd say, since the end of the Cold War, right? Because in the beginning of the 90s, this argument, well, NATO is dead because it was a Cold War, security alliance, long live the new NATO, and while they may have now a shiny new building in Brussels, there are bigger and bigger tensions about, for example, how much the European governments should use for their defense. And there's the 2%, the magic yardstick of 2% of the GDP that should be used for defense. I'm not sure where Italy is actually on that. But Germany for sure doesn't have it. Germany has about 1.2, 1.3% of their GDP that they use for defense. And only about 3 to 4 of the 28 EU member states reach the 2% target. That is seen as so important for the Trump administration, even though in reality it is not all that important. Okay? Plus, think about this. What's kind of ironic or interesting right now is that NATO, being a largely US equipped, largely US financed, and US invented security alliance, is also, of course, now actively questioned by the Trump administration. Something that many sort of even classic Republicans in America really find terrible, right? But ironically, as you know, on the European side, we have many folks here too who question NATO and supplying that shield and basically leading us too close to the West after the end of the Cold War. Okay, multilateralism, we talked about this. The Europeans adhere always to multilateral institutions. But there you also see a slow demise of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the WTO for sure, as well as the World Bank. And in general, we both tend to be also very important large democracies. But I don't want to get into this. I mean, we can do this. We can talk about the state of democracy, right? As you know, with populism and Trump, and so many things have changed. We wouldn't have assumed even 5 years ago. Okay. Another important factor that's always referenced in the debate about transatlantic relations are, of course, the supposed shared values that we share, be it on good governance. Again, right now we have slightly diverging views, I would posit. Human rights have been quite consistently being seen as essential for both sides, the Europeans as well as the United States. Okay? And even under sort of the limits and the constraints that the Trump administration puts on the State Department in the US right now, basically their foreign affairs apparatus, human rights are still at least nominally relevant. And of course development, global development, particularly as it regards the South. Well, trade relations, we talked about it already, so I don't need to repeat myself. And then we need to also look at some of the formal political institutions. With the end of the Cold War, both sides established a transatlantic agenda, meaning they established a policy framework in which the representatives, be it from the parliaments, from the legislatures, but also from on the ministerial level, where they meet regularly, at least once every 6 months, on either side, to talk about issues of common concern. Okay? So there you can see here, since the end of the Cold War, at least a structured attempt to make sure that you know what is going on the other side, and you can basically diplomatically resolve any issues before they arise. Obviously, it does not work always. Now, here a little bit of exactly public opinion data on what the impressions actually are, because the one part is, of course, the leadership, but we also, in democracies, supposedly, leaders take cues from public opinion, right? And so you need to look also at what is the larger populace thinking about the US or about the European Union. Well, I first want to guide your attention to the EU's favorability rating here. That's from 2002-2016. That's from the Pew Research Center, which is pretty much the US's largest public opinion survey instrument. And as you can see here, I would say, looking at just the graph over time, from 2002, you can see, of course, 2003, the unfavorable shot up because of particular French and German resistance during the Iraq invasion, right? So here you can explain that climb. But then, since then, at least till 2016, it's been pretty stable, right? There are no large ups and downs in that relationship. Now, that has something to do, I'd say, with the problem that most Americans don't really know. I mean, it's hard enough for us to understand the European Union, how it works, but most Americans have even less of an idea or think it is relevant, okay? In 2004, that's a little bit outdated, I couldn't get a better or younger number, 77% knew little or nothing about the European Union, okay? So my point being, many people are rather ignorant about the European Union. Of course, it is a complex instrument. Americans, if you know, that they also have a fairly classic understanding of republican democracy, and so for them the idea of sharing sovereignty is something dangerous and unheard of. And so that explains, in my opinion, to a large extent, that sort of stability. Now, if you break that down and you look at other countries and compare that with the US, you see here, this is also, of course, from the Pew Center, an update, country impressions on the European Union's influence. Slight difference, right? Not on the EU itself, but on the EU's influence by different countries. And if you just look at the second line from top, you see Canada and then the US, right? It really kind of still corresponds to the EU's evaluations about the EU in general. 56% mainly positive, with 30% more on the negative side. Of course, it shouldn't come as a surprise that Canada evaluates the EU much more positive than the US. And then you have a selection of the other countries, including the European member states themselves. France, Germany, Spain, and Greece. The only one that's at least standing out here, right, is Russia. If you look at Russia, 14% positive evaluation of the EU's instruments and 48% negative. I just want you to think about this also, because if the EU is not aligning with its Western partners so much, right, what are the alternatives to that? Okay. And we've seen already the EU's attempt of a pivot to Asia, their own pivot to Asia in many ways, but mostly far Asia. I think the Russia is a much more complex and complicated case because of our long-standing relations with Russia, but also some regions. And then, of course, the reverse impact. This is an international evaluation of the US's international image in 2018. Okay? So it's basically the mirror image of what you have above. And there you can just get the data on whichever aspect you want, right? Confidence in Trump should be no surprise that 70% of at least 25 countries in the world have no confidence in the Trump administration. 50% see the US in general, independent of the policymakers, as favorable, but 43 also as unfavorable. Then something that's at least touted and very important for the US always, that the US respects personal freedom of its people. 51% say yes, but close 37 no. Pleasure. And the US takes into account the interests of other countries. Well, not surprising here, 70% think that's just simply not the case anymore. And that the US is doing either more, less, or about the same to address major problems, basically the multilateral question. The multilateralism question. So 37%, the plurality of opinions, basically state that the US is really not helping or making things better across the globe. Even though, of course, if you know something about the US, many folks in the US believe that they do, and that they're indispensable, right, for the welfare of the planet, even with a misguided foreign policy. Okay, so what are some of the explanatory factors? Well, and give me just a sec. Yes, and this is I'm taking first up the second part. Well, we have to look again at the leadership question. And here you have this nice temporal graph that goes from 2001 till 2018, till last year. And these are the favorability ratings just for the leaders. And it becomes very evident, right, that you have significant differences in approval of either Democratic presidential candidates. Bill Clinton had pretty much, before 2001, Bill Clinton had pretty much a similar high approval rating in key EU countries. And I'm not sure if you can see it in the back, but the red line, and they're pretty much the same, right? The red line is the UK. You can see here that just at the end, the UK has generally slightly higher approval ratings. And then blue is Germany, yellow France, and green is Spain. But these are really dramatic shifts here. Okay? We're talking here from the end of the Clinton administration, where it was still between 50 and 20%, under the George W. Bush administrations, the two with the Iraq War in particular went down to the single digits. And then remember, you had the beginning of the global financial crisis, right? The glorious end of the George W. Bush administration that was picked up by Obama, and then it shot immediately up into the 80s and 90s for President Obama. But then, of course, the same process occurred with the beginning of the Trump administration, where we now see 7% approval in Spain, 9% in France, and 10 in Germany. That's down on average, 70 to 80%. Okay, so there is definitely an important factor, public opinion approval of the other country's leaders, because it imprints on the general impression about the country. And so the question is exactly, but we cannot just look at the US, we also have to consider EU leadership, and there's not only this power vacuum that I was talking about earlier, but also that so far the Merkel-Macron leadership team, particularly given that Britain is on its way out, that there has, I would consider that rather a failure in trying to assume a more constructive and active stance against the precarious leadership of the United States. To the first part, geopolitics and multipolarity. Right, and geopolitics, I think you hopefully know what geopolitics means, right? It's just sort of the general, more strategic interaction of countries, particularly now that we're moving from a unipolar, US-dominated moment into a multipolar system. Well, there's the EU sphere of the US's Asia pivot, again, that began under the much-loving Obama administration, continues, therefore. But if you know something about the Trump administration's foreign policy, you know also that it's in general quite isolationist and very nationalistic. So I would dare to say, and I hear that over and over again, no matter if I talk to folks from the EU delegation in Washington, D.C., or any other ambassadors or consuls, that they really have the impression that the United States just retracts from foreign policy making. The State Department is seriously understaffed. Many offices are not even filled. Many posts are not even filled. And that has its own disastrous effects for foreign policy making and for transatlantic relations. The G2 is also the fear, right, that the EU gets swallowed up or does cease to exist, of course, gets swallowed up in the relationship between the two giants, the US and China. And again, the West against the West scenario becomes less likely with Brexit, because then the West gets further split, and of course with the weakening of the transatlantic relationship that's already in place. Well, again, values have been cited always as part of the official rhetoric of transatlantic relations, but if you also look, we don't only have an emphasis on human rights on both sides, or democracy and good governance, and the rule of law, we also have quite different norms that we need to talk about. And those are, of course, differences in the acceptance and institutionalization of neoliberal market models, okay, where we still see clear difference between, in the US, there's not even there's no legal provision for any type of holidays, okay? That just goes to show you that we still have it fairly good here. I know that we also have retrenched welfare states here, and there's a big debate about this, of course, and partly because of the EU as well, but it's no comparison to the United States. Well, with regards to sovereignty, I mentioned it already. Very clear, different, historically determined notions of what sovereignty means and how important sovereignty for a country is. The use of weapons in general. There's this whole debate, right, about the Europeans wanting to become civilian power Europe. We're starting to question this now with the EU's 2016 global strategy, and sort of that we see that we have a perceived need to be more active and maybe project power, because if you can't project power, it's harder to influence others, particularly in a more security risk environment. And as you know, the US has already traditionally and consistently a much higher defense expenditures. Their defense expenditure, even with the wars right now, is about way more. It's more than double all of the Europeans' defense expenditures together. Death penalty. That's also something that separates us in terms of values and norms. We have a moratorium on death penalty, so no death penalty in the European Union. The US still has, depending on the state at least, the death penalty, and that, at least on a diplomatic level, is significant. And of course the question of populism. And as you know, this is something that ironically rather connects us, that on both sides of the Atlantic we see populism, but in its own variation. Right? Let's see that. We'll talk about later. And of course, these larger institutionalization forms of multilateral collaboration. Obviously, on the economic front, it seems that the Trump administration is not very keen, or does not, I would suggest, really understand how the EU's foreign trade policy works. You can see this in the way, at least, the Trump administration talks about it. United Nations is also totally irrelevant, I'd say, to the United States, because even the Security Council doesn't seem to be such a bulwark of American hegemony anymore as it once used to be. Climate change, you know that the withdrawal of the Paris Climate Agreement by the United States, right? So that presents its own problem, and we see a further emphasis in the European Union, in Brussels, on climate change policies, even with the next 7-year budget. So here you see already really the positions stake out, and they are very different. NATO, again, the open question, because it seems that neither of the two sides really recognizes NATO as all that important, and any other institutions, as for example the ICC, the Criminal Court, or the International Court of Justice. So in terms of multilateral institutions, we need to just recognize that there is a distinct procedural difference in that the EU has a more procedural approach, tries to engage through diplomacy, even if that takes much longer, because in the EU itself, as you know, everything takes longer, because you have the coordination need of 27 or 28 countries before you can implement a common policy. Whereas, of course, the US is much more outcome and performance-oriented, right? But can also act quicker, just like authoritarian states can often act quicker in that sense. And then to kind of conclude, I probably term the relationship in the future between these two blocks as sort of an instance of competitive cooperation. Okay? We have the competition, we do have competition. Right now, they're more economically determined. I also see them, but I see them as also determined by these different values that will become much more pronounced. Even trade and security, there are underlying deeper value disagreements that will create a larger rift in the future. And that being said, one important question is, of course, was the election of Donald Trump just a 4-year mistake, or right with the next elections in the U.S. looming in next November, a year from now, Will there be an 8-year policy process that may lead to larger differences between the EU and the US? Even with a hung parliament as they have over there, hung Congress. And therefore I posted here, but again, don't give too much on this, okay? I posted here some public opinion of, pre-election polls, how Donald Trump would match up against the most prominent Democratic potential candidates. So you see here, in all of these scenarios, Donald Trump would lose. However, between now and next November, a lot of things can happen, okay? Many folks talk about the beginning of a global recession, that the trade wars between the US and China, between the US and the EU will become worse, and that if there's a case of a recession, many things can change. In one hand, it may make it more likely, of course, for Donald Trump to not get re-elected if there's a recession in the US. Okay. On the other hand, it is also right now, one of the first things that Trump did domestically was a tax reform and lowering income tax. And the Americans in general feel that they're economically stable. Unemployment is quite low again after coming out of the years of the global recession. And as you know, people often vote with their wallet books, right? So don't give too much on these pre-election polls, I'd say. It's going to be, that political circus will be with us for the whole next year. Then the other question is about, independent if Trump gets another 4 years or not, will it work as sort of his actions, will it work as a uniter of the European Union? Imprinting on the European leaders that with this counterpart we have to be more unified together? Or will he be successful in one way or another? I don't think right now he is so successful. He's actually uniting the Europeans more. Or will he be successful in sort of applying a divide and conquer strategy, right? As a populist, aggressive dividers, who of course wants to rather engage bilaterally than multilaterally, and then maybe also use various tactics. Think of Steve Bannon's activities, right? Here in Italy and elsewhere, for example. His former political advisor. So that's a big question as well. And of course the basis that the US was never a true multilateral power nor civilian power. And if European foreign policy is something, it is A, multilateral, and at this point still civilian. There's a lot of talk about more defense investment, but the track record of European unification for the past 20-25 years has shown it has not worked. We don't want to invest really in defense. Some countries make the case they don't need to, they're surrounded by EU friends. There is the talk of PESCO, for example, right? The structure close to defense collaboration, but many say that has more to do with Brexit and the fact that the UK is now out than with the US. So Michael Smith, he's one of also the major writers in transatlantic relations, a couple of years back, he gave you also 4 different potential future scenarios. And he asked, will the EU become a subaltern or remain a subaltern partner? I'll tell you in a second what they exactly mean. I highlighted here the subcontractor, because I think this is where we are at this stage right now. We're subcontractors of the US in the transatlantic relations. A substitute, or a subversive actor in relation to the US. Okay, the subaltern would be a case where the EU has no agency on its own in that bilateral relationship, and we would basically be a pure executor of the US's wishes. I think probably the Cold War era, it could be characterized in that way, that the EU was a subaltern. Now we're in the space where we are subcontractors. We're sort of junior partners in that relationship, right? Where both have some input, but as you know, particularly if you think of defense, which is very important, but also, I would say, in many ways in trade, the US certainly is more dominant. Going forward, or what is an alternative, would be a substitute. that the EU could emancipate itself in both defense and security, as well as trade policy, but any other policy, climate policy, you name it, development policy, so that they would substitute for the US's dominant role. But still having, trying to keep the official value discourse as similar as possible. And then the last, most aggressive notion is the subversive actor, that the EU really kind of becomes a more confrontational actor and has no issues, for example, what we see now with the Iran deal, well, not very successfully, I should say, to work out a counter position to the US's policy in that regard. And then just one last thought. If the EU wants to be viewed as an equal partner, it needs to, of course, solve also its internal crisis, because its internal crisis, the Brexit has to, one way or another, the discussion has to stop, because it distracts us internally from foreign policy. The refugee crisis, I'd say, is still not being resolved in many ways. The euro is also still on shaky grounds. If you look at the political economy discussions that I think you just had, right? So I think those need to be resolved. The burden sharing, that depends on the attitude that you have on transatlantic relation, how much you are willing to actually share any kind of defense or trade burden. Okay, with that, I'll leave it. And so we have time for Q&As. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so now we are ready, no, he is ready for questions, for your questions, comments, and so on. Yes, there is a question. Unfortunately, we don't have the mobile microphone, the flying microphone, so you have to speak loudly. And
good afternoon, Markus. Thiel. My name is Roger. I'm from Gimo University, Moscow. Thank you for your lecture, and I have two questions.
Sure.
One of which is devoted to differences in US-EU approaches to sovereignty. I would like to know whether there was some other cases except intervention into Iraq of these different approaches. And the second question is devoted to your last slide, and US view of European Union as an equal partner. Do you really believe that US will admit such situation and in future will consider European Union as an equal partner, since it is not beneficial to the United States?
Yes, good question, thank you. Well, with the first question about the notion of varying or different notions of sovereignty, and I think you referenced the Iraq case in there. I was referring really to their domestic, the US's domestic ideology or idea about sovereignty, and the Europeans' idea of sovereignty. I was not referring, by doing that, I wasn't referring up to Iraq and, questions of R2P, right, the responsibility to protect and how much you can breach other nations, third nations' sovereignty. But even with those two, you see various differences, right? I mean, the EU itself is shared sovereignty. Much of what we do in the European Union is a sharing of sovereignty. And so for the US, it's incomprehensible that countries would give up the traditional notions or parts of that traditional sovereignty in order to gain that kind of shared sovereignty that the Europeans have created. That's what I meant, right? So that's the first part. And the second, I mean, I don't know if you had a chance to read my piece, but I think it should become pretty clear, right, that I don't think that in the foreseeable future the US or the Europeans will, but that the US would ever consider the Europeans as equal partners.
But how the European Union can get this notion of equality?
How the Europeans can get this notion of equality?
How they can fight for this maybe?
Yes, I think providing the 2% for GDP for defense will not do the case, okay? I think the Europeans have, since at least the end of the Cold War, they have really tried to make it clear to the United States, have shown goodwill in very many cases. I mean, much of the transatlantic institutional architecture, in terms of the transatlantic agenda, the transatlantic ministerial meetings, much of that has come from the EU side. The transatlantic the TTIP, that was largely an initiative by the Europeans. Okay, so in that sense, I think the Europeans have always, not always, but they have often attempted to become more of an equal partner and thereby being better recognized by the United States. I just don't think that the US really would ever. And it goes back to your first word you said, a large part has to do with a different understanding of sovereignty.
Thank you.
Guys, questions, comments? I mean, this is
an interesting time that we're living right now. Right? There should be some questions or comments about this. I mean, this is unheard of. The Trump administration pretty much has blown out what we've learned and studied, right, for decades out of the window. So, yes, please. Can you just speak up?
Yes. How will the impeachment procedure affect the stock market? Like, what happens if Trump gets impeached?
Yes. Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Oliver from the Netherlands.
Thank you. Hi. Well, the impeachment proceedings, as you know, they are ongoing, but there has been for the long time, and the impeachment proceeding, right, is basically an official sanction on the US president that could eventually lead to the removal. But I don't see a removal of the president with a Republican-controlled Senate, right? That's just, unless, you know, there are really, really extraordinary circumstances, and we live already in pretty extraordinary ones. So with a hung Senate, but with a Senate that's Republican-controlled, there's too much of Republican unity against that. And secondly, it is a dangerous game. I mean, think about it, right? There are many pressing issues also in the US right now. It is trade, it is the opioid crisis. There are migration issues that the US has too, many other issues, right? So for the Democrats to focus the attention for such a long time on discrediting the president makes the Democrats very volatile, and some would say even unelectable in the coming year. So that's why Nancy Pelosi, for a long time, didn't even want to start, right, with impeachment proceedings. So again, there's still some room for extraordinary developments within the next year, but it is definitely a risky strategy. And the Democrats see that as well. But then, you know, at least the official argument is being made that once it gets into sort of, what you call this, foreign intervention in US policy, right? Sort of, you know, the relation particularly with Russia, then that's an impeachable offense that even the Democrats would have to act upon. At least that's the official narrative.
So don't you think that America is like gradually being isolated from the rest of the world, especially when we talk about this multipolar world at present, and it's going to like directly one way or the other affect the foreign policy and the economy of the US, right? And how do local Americans perceive this like situation?
Introduce yourself.
I'm Palwashish Pak and I'm from Pakistan.
Hi, thanks. Oh, okay, that's great. Yes, so the isolation question. As you've seen, I think at least on the elite level, and who makes policy? It's the policy elites, right? So on the elite level, I think they're still on both sides, particularly on the European sides, fairly adaptable. If the Trump administration, let's say, is not getting re-elected next year, I would say. They're still fairly adaptable. You've seen this with the approval processes that have switched very quickly, very dramatically, right? So you have, you know, the US was really not a welcome partner after the Iraq invasion in 2003, and then everything changed in a heartbeat with Obama, even though Obama's foreign policy priorities were not all that beneficial for the Europeans. Okay? So there's that adaptability on the elite level, which matters. Now, I do think you're right. I mean, the US, of course, it isolates itself somewhat, but if you look at it, Brazil's Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, right? They get along very well. And Brazil is the regional hegemon for Latin America. The Israeli-US relationship is very strong. Okay? And Israel is certainly an important power in the Middle East, I'd say. And then together with the fragility and instability of the rest of the Middle East, I think that's important. The relationships with China are definitely bad. I honestly don't know. Pakistan seems to be always sort of a more practical and very instrumental interrelationship. With Russia, yeah, that's, I think, I would say closer than ever, but that's at least not the official version. So, I think that isolationism, it's not total isolationism, right?
It's still against, don't you think that it's like against the American values of like freedom and liberalism? That's like how they
You know what, honestly, that question, that has not been resolved in my opinion. Okay, that whole, Wilson started right at the beginning of the 20th century, President Wilson. Basically, he was one of the most important modern internationalizer, right, of international liberalism. But even that whole Wilsonian internationalism is quite heavily debated. And that it was even debated before the Trump administration came to power. So the United States, in policy circles, they are not unified necessarily on the idea or sold on the idea of Wilsonian internationalism, okay? And much less so the people. I mean, I'm sure you've seen those YouTube clips, or if not, you may want to watch those YouTube clips of when the ordinary Americans are asked to pinpoint or tell us, where Iran is, right, on the map, or Syria, or wherever the US is interfering at the moment. So the US populace, I mean, that would be interesting to look at that public opinion data on isolationism, but I would say also that they are more isolationist than internationalist.
Yes, there. Is there...
Can you tell us about the issues that an eventual European tax over Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon could create? And the second question is...
So basically it's internet taxation,
yeah,
is that...
this kind of thing. Yeah. And do you think that the US is ready to cooperate with other countries to create a global regulation framework, over these times, one times to the internet?
Please introduce yourself.
Grégoire from France.
Hi, can you repeat the second?
It's very linked to the previous one. Do you think the US is ready to cooperate with other countries to create a global regulation framework over these times?
Of a? Global regulation framework of?
Over there. So basically how to regulate the internet market.
Oh, the internet market, internet companies. Okay, so that's basically... Well, yeah, I'm not an expert on these internet taxation question, but so I'm not going to give you, exact more of an opinion than anything else. But I would certainly think that these global internet giants, right, exactly Google, and that you see the same with Amazon, right, that the Europeans had to already close, on pressure by the EU, some of these, at least taxation loopholes, if you think of Ireland and others. So the Europeans are very clear and firm on this, and then I think in France, right, that's particularly France introduced a 3% or whatever tax on online transactions. That is definitely seen as radical, right, or also radical by the US side, and so that feeds into the further trade negotiations. But honestly, I don't think that there's enough consensus amongst Europeans, you may know more about this, on implementing an online tax based on the French model. I don't think there's a European consensus on that, nor am I not sure that there will ever be one. But certainly, the French government doesn't make it easier by, doing this. They don't make it easier with the US.
Yes?
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Francesco from the University of Turin. And there are lots of Eastern and Central European countries that are getting closer to China and historically were actually allies of the USA. Because of the 17+1 platform, cooperation platform. So what I would like to know is, how do you think that this will affect the relations between the USA and the EU?
Thank you. Yes, you're definitely right. I think it goes back to the problem of that power vacuum that I mentioned earlier, that we don't leadership or power vacuum. You can call that both from the European side, right? You see this particular with the failing of the starting of the accession negotiations with Northern Macedonia and Albania, I think, at the last Council summit meeting, right? Where President Macron, didn't want to start negotiations, although the Visegrad 4 and many other countries asked him to please do so. We've seen this, I think, also already in the Turkey, what this kind of inactivity does to people or to countries that want to become part but then are disillusioned by being kept outside. And you see this now. I think Putin, as well as the Chinese government, Xi Jinping, they're both heavily moving into the Balkan area, right? Buying up ports, establishing trade negotiations. Isn't Serbia now trying to access or become member of the European Eurasian Union? Okay, that is pretty scary, but it is also tellingly sad. It's a testament to the EU's inability to really provide a more active blueprint, a yardstick that would help these countries really not playing these geopolitical games. Does that answer your question?
Good evening, I'm Miriam from Italy. I would like to ask if, about the issue of the espionage of Chinese and if there is some sort of network cooperation between the EU countries and the USA.
Okay, on Chinese espionage. Yeah, okay.
Quick answer, I don't know. I really don't. That's a very specialized thing that I mean, as somebody who's just generally politically, I think, well informed, I have not heard anything on that. The only indication that gives you already something about some slight divergence of approaches is the issue of Huawei, right? Huawei, the internet provider. At least in Germany, Huawei has given the green light, the Chinese company, to build up the internet market because it was, there was a question of, okay, if we're using Huawei, would we also possibly import any sort of spyware and these kind of issues? And the US is still blocking Huawei left and right. So there you can see, but that's only just, the case of Germany. I don't know, to be honest, I couldn't answer that. Right?
Do you think there is a Cold War environment, like for the counter-espionage
the question of espionage, I'm certain, I mean, we have a long-standing Cold War model, right, that has worked fairly well, and we've seen these spy cases pop up here and there. So I do think there's a lot still in process that we just don't know about. I mean, it's part of their job not to be visible, right? At the same time, I'm also always hesitant of any kind of, any sort of theories that go too close to this conspiracy theory action, right? But as you know, a lot about the US-Russia relationship. After all these commissions, after all these investigations that the US government domestically now had, the Mueller report, right? We still don't know exactly what that relationship between the Trump administration or the highest levels of Trump administration and Putin's government is. There was another question.
Yes. Hi. I am Romeo Francesco from Torino University, and I would like to ask, in the perspective of a second term of the Trump administration, and Boris Johnson will win the election in the UK. If UK and the USA will write new trade agreements, how this will affect the relationship between the USA and the UK and US?
Exactly, absolutely. And I think that's what I think alluded to during my talk, right? This will further split the Europeans basically in two and give the Trump administration the choice of playing both sides, the UK as well as continental Europe or the European Union, out against each other. And in general, you know, again, with the Trump administration you never know, but in general I would say that the Trump administration has closer affinity to Boris Johnson. As you've seen this in the Brexit pronouncement, right? The White House has come out very supportive for Brexit, against the European Union in general, over and over again. So in my mind, there's no doubt that the Trump administration would, if Boris Johnson does indeed get elected, would try to fashion a important trade agreement with the UK. Very sort of Anglo, you know, free trade, neoliberal model that of course would contrast with anything that was proposed in TTIP, and it would further harm the European Union. But, you know, let's get there first. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ignacio, I'm from Argentina. I have two questions. First of all, you mentioned there's a difference of concept of populism between Europe and the United States. If you can briefly answer that question. And the second, there's many theories about the definition of power of the USA, and I would like to know your point of view of that. And in case you think there's a declination of power, which would be the position of Europe?
You meant the declination of power or decline of power?
Decline of power.
Okay. And when you say decline of power, what do you refer to specifically? Because it's such a broad, you know, do you mean domestic power? Do you mean the US's role internationally? What kind of power?
International governance.
Okay, okay. So multilateral problem solving, that kind of coordination power. Okay. And so the US's take on that. And the US's take on that. Okay, good, thank you. Well, as you know, we have populism on both sides, that's for sure. But it is, in the US, it comes very clearly out of a conservative and rightist, what we call isolationist and nativist camp, right? But in Europe, of course, we also have populism on both the left, the extreme left, as well as the extreme right. And unfortunately, and you know this, I don't have to tell you this, in Europe we also have the EU, which can serve as an easy scapegoat that doesn't exist in the United States, right? So in that sense, I think there are, even though the effects of populism are similar, I would say, in that it erodes democratic institutions, in that it polarizes, maybe unnecessarily so, the population. The causes are different. Okay. And so with regards to the second question about the decline of, I guess, multilateral organizations through the US, if you mean what, again, yeah, that also hinges a little bit on the re-election of Donald Trump, and even that, to be very honest, as much as I think a re-election of Donald Trump would be scary if it was to occur, and it is right now basically 50-50, if you see, right, it's between the wallet voting and the fact that he doesn't seem to be electable by a slight majority. But then again, remember, US elections are not population based, they're based on electoral votes by the states, which is why Hillary Clinton got also more popular votes, but didn't end up being president. But anyway, I do think the future of the globe, the global problems, climate change and global inequality, I'd say, are probably the biggest threats that we face. Because global inequality also leads to just as climate, to migration, to refugee streams, right? To these kind of demographic shifts and movements. So in that, we do need multilateral approaches. And I mean, you've seen this. Even China invests heavily in that multilateralism. It's just a more hegemonic Chinese style of multilateralism, I would dare to say. Okay, so you cannot get geopolitics totally out of it. But what I'm trying to tell you is, even if we had another 4 years of Trump, there will be another president after him. And I mean, you know, we lived through George W. Bush and thought this was the end of the United States, right? And then came Obama, you know. So I think there may be, to say it simplified, another Obama in the works or at the horizon. And the increased threat of these larger global issues will necessitate a US inclusion in multilateral governments. And I think really I would hope that the Trump administration is really in mistake or an aberration, and that, you know, many people who did that protest vote for Donald Trump will regret it now and see that in the long run you cannot run a country like this. At least not one of the most important countries on the planet.
Other questions? Otherwise, yes. Yes,
Donald Trump threatened many times to withdraw the World Trade Organization. Does the American administration consider this WTO as an efficient tool to control China and China internal affairs with trading, trading control, francs to trade, to influence China internal affairs?
Well, I mean, I think only the US only would see or view the WTO as a legitimate, if you want to say so, international multilateral trade instrument if it serves their purpose. That's as, you know, that's as simple as that, right? If there is no opportunity for the trade dispute settlement panel to come out in favor for the US will, at least under the Trump administration, will very quickly withdraw from the WTO. That's my opinion. Because as you've seen, and you probably know this very well, the US favors bilateral trade deals over multilateral anyway.
That's a weird question a little bit, but what if we lived in another universe, okay? And Mrs. Clinton was the president? Don't you think that the things would be the same or even worse between the USA and the EU? Because, you know...
Yeah, why would you think that things would be worse at the
I think that, I would say, Democrats and Republicans are two different faces of the same medal, okay? I live when you're in the USA, and I know Democrat people, Republican people, and for me, they think all in the same way, but they just say it in different words, okay? So, I mean,
okay.
superior to anyone else.
Okay. Yeah. So just to bring it back to, you know, basically my talk is that I think in a way you are correct, and this is exactly why the Europeans need to develop what the global strategy already called it, and other scholars call it strategic autonomy. The Europeans need to find ways to determine their own fate, be it in economic policies, be it in trade, be it in foreign defense, be it in environment or any other thing. Okay. Again, because exactly, Hillary Clinton would be more receptive, that's for sure, towards European demands, but it's not being said that she would always go along. And the other thing is, the US would still see itself as the more dominant partner, so there is not, going back to the question about equality, I think it's illusionary for us to think that the US would ever want to reach equality or would want to provide equality to the Europeans. Because the Europeans, in their eyes, are, for the large part, inferior partners, but particularly because of the history of the 20th century.